The gentleman yields. Does anyone wish to speak on the amendment?
Mr. Chairman.
You're recognized.
Okay. I would ask my colleague a couple of questions about this. One is, I looked at the list of schools that are still have these institutes. Most of them I didn't recognize. Stanford kind of jumped off the page at me, though. And I was curious as to whether you or your staff or the committee staff had touched base with Stanford, which would seem to be kind of at the heart of the issue with respect, because it's in Silicon Valley, it's got the type of R&D research programs that are going on, but they've opted to continue going forward with this effort. Did you get any feedback from Stanford University about the impact of this legislation or the need for this legislation?
The gentleman yields.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, thank you. And I think my colleague, we've gotten feedback from a lot of universities. And specifically to the question of Stanford, I need to check, but a lot of universities have made the decision since I offered this legislation about 2 years ago to sever those ties and to move away from it. And those that have it, and in the case of Stanford, if they are one, and we have gotten feedback from academia writ large that this policy is very much in line with what the DoD is already doing with their grant program, and really falls under the auspice of national security protection. A lot of universities are doing good work. Stanford is one of those. But the prevention of research to a scientific conclusion is very much a concern, in addition to the theft of intellectual property or worse that we've seen in some of these cases. So yes, we have gotten quite a bit of feedback, positive feedback from universities. I'll check on Stanford in particular. I yield.
I'd appreciate that. And just as a follow-up, the University of Maryland's in my district, and they were one of the first institutions to become participants with the Confucius Institute. They also dropped it recently, I think because of this type of legislation that's gone through. They did not express concerns about infiltration from, communist China or anything. Really, it was just a concern about not wanting to lose funding. They didn't want the penalty of the loss of funding for research. And I do note, too, here that the GAO report that's dated October 2023 references that the FBI, I'll just read it, stated that the agency has not found enough evidence of criminal activity or malign influence associated with Confucius Institutes to prioritize them as a national security concern. And in addition to that, I would raise, or sort of ask about this point, if I'm reading the right version of your amendment, I think there had been a waiver language in the ranking member's previous legislation. At least the version of your bill, I don't see that here. Is there, am I reading the right version? Is there no waiver language in your bill, or?
Gentleman is recognized
Yield back.
to answer the question.
No, there is no waiver language, and that really was the issue with the 117th Congress's version, which was not brought to the floor, by the way. So we could have made strides there last year, or we didn't. And I draw your attention to the National Association of Scholars' viewpoint on this, a collective network of academia and professionals throughout the United States who do have a concern about this. There's already precedent for this. This is not new. It just continues to bolster what DoD in their research programs have already done that applies to academia. And the last thing I'll say on this particular subject is a lot of times, and one of the reasons that waivers are very dangerous is because CIs will change their name. They will, like an LLC, be able to move into a new organization. DoD has had a heck of a time tracking those. They've done a very good job of tracking them. But one of the reasons that the waivers are not a good idea is because they do change their names, the entities do shift, and that money is still available with the strings attached. That can compromise our national security. Yield back.
Thank you. Just a couple more questions. Oh, I'm running out of time. I would note quickly then that DOD.
If you want to ask a colleague to request some time and yield to you, I'm more than willing to support that or suggest it even.
Happy to do that.
Gentleman yields.
Thank you, Mr.
You have
Goldman.
5
Thank you,
minutes.
Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that. Just with respect to the waiver, I think, if I'm reading this right, the DOD language does have a waiver that apparently hasn't been abused because, if I'm reading this right, none have been sought, but at least they have the option to do so. And I guess I would raise the issue with respect to your language because, well, you got an absolute ban on funding is number one. So the risk or the exposure an institution would face if they misunderstand or make the wrong assessment about whether this would be applicable or not could be pretty severe depending on where their funding comes from with respect to Homeland Security. And I did have some questions about sort of the scope of, you've got the definitions for Chinese entity of concern. One of these, I think it's E, provides support to any security. If they do any of these things, they could be considered one of these entities. E is provide support to any security, defense, police, or intelligence organization of the government of the People's Republic of China or the Chinese Communist Party. So, I was just thinking about it. So for police, for example, if you have an entity that provides translators, like an academic institution, and that whole institution would then become defined as an entity under your Section 2, then if that entity provided anything to Stanford, for example, like a translator or a professor or an exchange student or vice versa, if I'm reading this correctly, in absence of a waiver provision, they could lose all of their funding with respect to the Department of Homeland Security. Am I reading that correctly?
Does the gentleman?
Gentleman's recognized.
I yield, I'm sorry.
The definition is the same as it was in the text of the bill last year. So the definition of a Chinese entity of concern, Confucius Institute, has not changed. And that's a key provision.
Just on that point, if I could reclaim my time, I'll yield back in a second. But that's the point of the waiver, though, right? So in the previous bill, you had the waiver provision so that if there was a scenario where that was a broader application, then might make sense in the specific terms of whatever that institution is, then someone could waive the applicability of this. But in your version, there's no safety valve like that. And I yield back.
Actually, my apologies to Mr. Goldman. It's his time, so you
I'm
yield.
sorry.
And we recognize Mr. Pfluger, I assume. Yeah, of course.
Yeah, and again, to go back kind of to the simplicity of this bill, it really is a choice for each university. And they're going to have to weigh those risks and rewards with their own funding mechanisms. And if they believe that they so desperately need the CCP funding, then that's their choice. And I think that's something that each institution, in the case of University of Maryland, that they have pulled back, and many others have done that, actually quite a few. So I think the safety outlet is the fact that there is no waiver, that you're going to make a choice, and it's either you're in favor of protecting what could be classified information, what could be used in the formation of national security, either tactics, techniques, procedures, research that leads to the security of this country, or you're not. And I think one thing that is different this year, Mr. Ivey, is the threat landscape has completely changed and morphed into what we anticipated it was going to be, but it's here. We have a hot war occurring in Europe. We have an outbreak of war in the Middle East. I know this committee has done many classified briefings on the threat that Confucius Institutes pose to our society. We've done hearings and had witnesses that have told us about CCP-sponsored police stations in major cities like New York City. We have to be eyes wide open, and that's why the approach here is we're going to draw a line in the sand. We're not banning that funding. We're just simply saying that universities need to make a choice, and that choice will be up to them. And if they need DHS funding, then they're going to have to make the choice to not have CCP-sponsored money. I yield to you.